There comes a moment in every life when silence becomes heavier than words, when love turns into distance and family becomes a battlefield of quiet betrayals. William John was a man who had given everything, his years, his heart, his pride, only to be left behind by the very people he lived for. At 58, a widower and forgotten father, he stood in a house full of memories and ghosts, realizing that sometimes the deepest wounds aren't made by strangers, but by the ones who once called you dad. But life has a way of circling back, of turning heartbreak into power and pain into purpose. What began as rejection would soon unfold into a reckoning no one saw coming. Because when truth hides behind silence too long, it doesn't die, it waits. And when it finally speaks, it shakes the walls of everything built on lies. This is the story of a man who lost everything, and then found himself. Of a father's quiet revenge, a daughter's redemption, and the legacy of a love that refused to disappear. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who test the limits of our forgiveness. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, or had to rebuild yourself from that pain? Tell me where you're watching from and share your story in the comments. Your truth might be the voice that gives someone else the strength to rise again. The morning light filtered weakly through the stained lace curtains, catching the dust that floated in the air like suspended time. William John stood in the kitchen, motionless, his hands resting on the chipped counter. The kettle hissed faintly, the same one Elaine used every morning for 30 years. The rhythm of her old routines still echoed in the house, the soft hum she made while stirring sugar into her tea, the sound of her slippers brushing against the tiles. But now only silence answered him. That silence had grown thick, like a fog that clung to his spirit. The old clock on the wall ticked without mercy, marking hours that meant nothing. On the table sat unopened bills, stacked like tiny accusations. He could barely look at them anymore. His pension had run dry months ago, the few odd jobs he'd taken on stopped when his knees began to betray him. Still, the house, this creaking, fading home, was his last connection to her. To them. He wandered into the living room where picture frames lined the mantelpiece. His thumb brushed the glass over a photo of Elaine, her smile wide, her eyes carrying that same mixture of strength and softness that had drawn him to her decades ago. Next to her was Amanda, their only child, a small girl in pigtails holding a sunflower. William swallowed hard. He whispered softly, "You'd have known what to say, Elaine." His voice cracked. "You always did." The doorbell startled him. He moved slowly, straightening his faded sweater before opening the door. Amanda stood there, elegant, polished, the faint scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her. Beside her was Chad, his tall frame stiff, his expression a mixture of politeness and boredom. "Daddy," Amanda said, stepping inside, eyes scanning the house like it was a relic she'd outgrown. "We just came by to check on you." "Good to see you both," William murmured, forcing a smile. But Chad was already glancing at his watch. The silence between them stretched thin. Amanda hesitated, her eyes falling on the ceiling stain above the dining table. "The roof's leaking again?" "Just a small drip," William said. "I'll take care of it." "Dad, it's been months," she sighed. "You shouldn't still be living here alone. The house needs work, and money." Her tone was gentle, but beneath it lingered impatience, the kind born not from care but from obligation. Chad shifted his weight. "She's right, Mr. John. Maybe it's time to sell. Get something smaller. Closer to us." William's jaw tightened. "Closer to you?" "Yeah," Chad said, already halfway toward the door. "Or, something manageable." Amanda reached out, touching William's arm. "We can help with the process. There are good agents who'd—" "No," William cut in quietly. "This house, this is all I have left of your mother." The air went still. Amanda looked away and for a moment, something flickered across her face, guilt, maybe, or exhaustion. "I know," she said softly. "But you can't live in memories forever, Daddy." They stayed only 30 minutes. When they left, the silence roared back, louder than before. William sat at the table long after the sound of their car faded. He stared at the empty chair across from him. He could almost see Elaine sitting there, her hands wrapped around her mug, her voice telling him to be patient, to keep faith. But the house felt colder now. The winter draft crept through the broken seals of the windows, and every creak of the floor reminded him that time was moving on, with or without him. He tried to fix the leak that evening, climbing onto an unsteady ladder, but the rusted nails and splintered wood only deepened his frustration. When a piece of plaster fell and grazed his arm, he sat down on the floor, breathing heavily. The house seemed to mock him. By midnight, the storm outside had begun. Rain drummed against the roof, and the steady dripping sound in the hallway returned, sharper this time, cruel in its persistence. William turned off the lamp and sat in darkness, listening to the rhythm of decay. He remembered the last night he and Elaine had shared in that kitchen. She'd been so weak then, but she'd still smiled at him, still tried to ease his pain even as she faded. "Promise me," she'd said, "you won't let this house break you." He hadn't understood it then. But now he did. It wasn't just about walls and memories, it was about him. The next morning he found himself standing by the front door with his coat on, staring at the road that led into town. The world outside seemed brighter, louder, unforgiving. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe a reason to hold on, maybe a reason to let go. In the distance, church bells rang. He thought of Elaine's laughter at Sunday picnics, of Amanda running barefoot through the grass, of the way his wife would tuck her hand into his and say, "You'll always have something to hold on to." But all he held now was silence. And for the first time he wondered if silence could break a man more completely than grief ever could. He closed the door, leaning against it as the wind howled outside. The bills were waiting. The roof still leaked. And his daughter, his last piece of family, was already slipping into the distance, too busy to notice how deeply he was unraveling. The silence grew heavier, pressing against him, shaping itself into something darker. The kind of quiet that doesn't just fill a house, it consumes it. Before we step deeper into William's story, let me ask you, have you ever watched someone fade under the weight of silence? Where are you watching from tonight, and have you ever held on to something you couldn't bear to let go? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. The boxes came first, stacked neatly by the door, labeled in Amanda's handwriting. William stood among them, holding his breath as the movers carried out the last pieces of a life he'd built. Each box felt like a quiet betrayal, each taped seal another reminder that Elaine's laughter would never echo in those walls again. He watched the old house fade in the rearview mirror of Amanda's car, its roof patched with tarps, its garden swallowed by weeds. The silence followed him there too, only now, it rode in the back seat like an uninvited ghost. East Austin felt different, louder, restless, alive in a way that made him uneasy. The apartment complex Amanda and Chad lived in was modern, clean, and cold. Glass and concrete everywhere, not a trace of warmth. William clutched his worn duffel bag, glancing at the rows of cars, the neighbors with headphones and dogs, people who barely nodded when they passed. Chad greeted him at the door with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Mr. John," he said, stepping aside. "Welcome to the city." William smiled faintly, nodding as he stepped inside. The apartment smelled of new paint and disinfectant, no trace of the home he once knew. Amanda had prepared a small corner in the guest room, a single bed, an old dresser, and a faded quilt she'd taken from his house. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We'll make it work," Amanda said, trying to sound upbeat. "Just for a while until things get better." He wanted to believe her. The first few days were polite, painfully so. Chad was courteous, offering small talk over breakfast, asking about the weather, football scores, traffic. But William could feel the tension simmering beneath each word. Chad's tone was clipped, his movements sharp, his sighs frequent. The discomfort grew thicker after small accidents began to happen. A misplaced tool in the garage, a wet towel left on the counter, the creak of William's shoes against the hardwood floor at night. Chad's patience thinned by inches. One afternoon, William offered to help with dishes after dinner. Amanda had cooked. Chad was scrolling through his phone at the table. The sink was piled high, and William wanted to feel useful, to contribute even in small ways. As he washed, one mug slipped from his hands, shattering against the floor. The sound was small but piercing. Chad looked up instantly. His face hardened. "That mug," he said, voice low, "was my mother's." William froze. I'm sorry, son. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Chad interrupted, but his jaw tightened. "Things happen." He stood, picked up the pieces, and tossed them into the trash with more force than necessary. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amanda stood by the sink, her face pale. "Chad, it was an accident." "I said it's fine," he repeated, heading for the living room. But William knew it wasn't. That night, from behind his bedroom door, he heard their muffled argument. Chad's voice, sharp, accusing, and Amanda's quiet pleas to just let it go. The sound of that marriage straining under something as small as a mug cut deeper than he expected. The next morning, Chad avoided him entirely. The politeness evaporated, replaced by a cool detachment that made every meal feel like an intrusion. William tried to stay out of the way, kept his footsteps light, his door closed, his presence minimal. But somehow even his silence seemed to irritate Chad. The remarks began slowly, disguised as jokes. "You know, Mr. John, this generation's got it tough. Rent's no joke these days. Must be nice not worrying about bills when someone else is covering everything. Or the worst of them, guess some folks just like living off family, huh?" William never answered. His pride burned quietly like a coal he refused to fan. He'd worked 40 years of his life without ever asking for a thing. But now, at 58, all his years of labor seemed to vanish in the eyes of one man. Amanda noticed, of course. Her eyes followed the tension, her hands fidgeted at dinner. But she said nothing. She'd smile softly and change the subject, the guilt plain in her eyes. She was caught, between the man who raised her and the man she married. Between comfort and conscience. William began spending hours walking the block, circling the complex just to avoid the apartment's heaviness. He'd sit on a park bench nearby watching cars pass, wondering when his own life had become something others tolerated. One night as he returned from his walk, he overheard Chad on the phone through the open balcony door. "He's not my responsibility, Amanda. I didn't sign up to be anyone's caretaker. We can't just keep letting him freeload here." William froze in the hallway. His heart pounded, not with rage but with the cold ache of humiliation. He stepped back into his room, closing the door quietly. The apartment that was supposed to be a refuge now felt like a cage, and every breath in it carried the weight of unwanted presence. Later he sat on the bed, staring at his packed suitcase by the wall. He hadn't unpacked it fully since he arrived. Maybe, deep down, he knew he was never meant to stay. In the distance, he heard Amanda's muffled sobs through the thin walls, the sound of someone who wanted to fix everything but no longer knew how. William turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, his thoughts circling the same truth over and over again, that sometimes betrayal doesn't come as a blow. Sometimes it comes softly, in silence, in the things left unsaid. The city lights flickered through the blinds, carving thin lines across his face. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger, tired, worn, and small. He whispered to himself, maybe Elaine was right. Maybe silence does break a man. And for the first time since her death, he wished she were there, not to comfort him but to tell him what to do next. The night outside deepened. Inside, the walls closed in, and the echo of Chad's words lingered in the air, "freeloader." It was a word William would never forget. Not because it was cruel but because it came from within the home of his own blood. And that, more than anything, made him begin to understand the quiet kind of anger that changes everything. The rain began just before dusk, slow and uncertain, like it too was hesitant to begin. William sat at the edge of the small bed in his room, the old duffel bag beside him, staring at the worn carpet that had started to fray near the dresser. His hands trembled as he folded his clothes, not from weakness, but from the weight of knowing this was the last time he'd packed them under a roof that wasn't his own. The apartment was quiet. Chad had gone to bed early, claiming a headache. Amanda lingered in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale in the half-light. She didn't speak, and that silence, her silence, cut deeper than any argument could have. William zipped the first suitcase and paused, the sound loud in the still air. His other suitcase was half filled with shirts, a photo of Elaine tucked carefully between them, wrapped in an old towel to keep it from breaking. Her smile peeked through the folds, a frozen memory of everything he'd already lost. He could feel Amanda's eyes on him, but she still said nothing. There were 1,000 words fighting their way to the surface between them. Apology, sorrow, fear, pride, but none of them survived the space between father and daughter. "It's just for a while," he finally said, his voice low. "Till I find somewhere else to settle." Amanda blinked hard, her chin trembling. "Daddy, you don't have to." "I do." He cut her off gently, not out of anger but mercy. "Your home should be peaceful. I won't be the reason it isn't." A tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a slow path before falling to the floor. "I didn't mean for it to get like this," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "We never do." The rain outside grew steadier, a soft drumming against the glass. He lifted his coats, one for the cold, one for the pride he still carried, and slid them into the bag. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, each second marking a quiet surrender. When he was done, he looked around the small room. The bed neatly made, the dresser empty, the faint scent of the lavender soap Amanda had left on the nightstand. He had lived there for only weeks, but somehow, it felt like a lifetime of shrinking into corners. Amanda moved closer, her hands trembling as she tried to help lift one of the suitcases. "It's heavy," she said softly. He shook his head. "It's not the suitcase that's heavy." They both froze in that moment, the words hanging like a confession neither of them could undo. When he reached the door, William paused. The sound of his heartbeat was louder than the rain. He looked back once, at the hallway where his daughter stood, tears gathering in her eyes, her lips trembling but refusing to move. He wanted her to stop him. To say something, anything, that would make him stay. But she only stood there, trapped in her silence. The doorknob turned beneath his hand, and the click that followed echoed like a final verdict. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like being erased. The elevator ride down was slow and metallic. Each floor that passed felt like another layer of his life peeling away. By the time the doors opened to the rain-slicked parking lot, he was no longer Amanda's father leaving his daughter's home. He was just another man with nowhere to go. The night air hit his face cold and sharp. He stood under the flickering streetlight, 2 suitcases at his feet, watching the water pool in the cracks of the pavement. For a brief second he thought of turning back. But pride, or maybe heartbreak, pushed him forward. The motel he found was a few miles away, an old place with faded paint and a neon sign that blinked vacancy in tired rhythm. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as William slid cash across the desk. "Room 14, the man muttered, handing him a key attached to a cracked plastic tag. The room smelled faintly of mildew and bleach. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling at the corners. But it was his, for now. He set the suitcases down and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the thin curtains, the neon glow painted the walls pink and blue in uneven pulses. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain thud against the window. The world outside felt far away, people laughing, cars passing, life moving on without him. He reached into his bag and pulled out Elaine's photo, placing it on the nightstand beside the cheap lamp. Her smile softened the room just a little. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I failed her, Elaine. I failed our girl." He ran a hand over his face, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible weight. The quiet pressed against him from all sides, thick and suffocating. In that dim room he felt the kind of loneliness that doesn't shout, it seeps. It crept into his chest, slow and relentless, until he couldn't tell if the ache inside him was sadness or shame. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the last time he'd felt wanted, truly wanted, not out of duty, not out of pity, but because he mattered. The rain began to ease, leaving behind only the sound of dripping from the motel sign outside. William turned off the light. The room sank into darkness, the neon glow fading to faint reflections across the wall. He exhaled slowly, the words coming out like a prayer no one would hear. "Even my own blood." And in that quiet confession, the world seemed to tilt just slightly, away from what had been, toward something colder, sharper, and far less forgiving. For the first time in his life, William John felt completely unwanted. Not by strangers, but by his own flesh and blood. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the smell of it still lingered, damp earth and asphalt creeping through the cracks of the motel's thin windows. William sat in the half-light, the lamp's yellow glow barely cutting through the darkness. The cheap clock on the wall ticked endlessly, and the world outside moved like a dream he no longer belonged to. Sleep had become a stranger to him. The bed was too hard, the silence too loud. He'd unpacked nothing but his grief. On the small table beside the bed sat his suitcase, the same one he'd carried from the home that no longer wanted him. Inside, beneath folded shirts and a worn jacket, his hand brushed against something rough and old. It was a book, a leather-bound diary, edges frayed, its cover marked by years of handling. Martha John, his mother's name, pressed faintly on the inside cover in ink now faded to gray. He hadn't seen it in decades. It had been tucked away in one of Elaine's boxes after Martha's funeral, long forgotten, hidden beneath years of memory and neglect. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment, unsure if he wanted to open it. The past had already taken so much, what more could it steal? But something in him, something tired and searching, pushed him to begin. The first entries were simple, the kind of notes a young mother might make. Recipes, laundry lists, mentions of a small boy with curious eyes and restless hands. "My William climbed the fence again today." He said the sky looked closer from there. He smiled faintly, tracing the words with his finger. But as the pages turned, the handwriting changed, from steady and hopeful to hurried, almost trembling. Then came the words that made his breath stop. "Harold says no one can ever know. He says his world would not understand a child like ours." William froze. The ink had bled slightly into the page, the pen pressing hard as though each word had been carved with pain. He read it again, slower this time, the meaning unfolding like a wound reopening. Harold James Sterling, that's his name. The man the city calls honorable, the man whose name fills the newspapers. He gave me his heart and his child but not his name. I promised to protect both. William leaned back, the diary trembling in his hands. The room seemed to shrink around him. The name, Sterling, hung in the air like a verdict. He'd heard it before, of course. Everyone had. Harold James Sterling, the respected businessman, philanthropist, and symbol of power in the state of Texas. The man whose company owned half the city's skyline. But what was Sterling to him? Nothing. And yet, everything. He turned the page. I told William his father died before he was born. Is Kinder that way? He deserves peace, not scandal. But every time he smiles, I see Harold's eyes. Sometimes I hate myself for the lie, but love is a heavier burden than shame. William's throat tightened. His mother's voice, gentle, patient, loyal, filled his mind. She had carried this truth alone, protecting him from a world that would have seen him as a mistake. The thought of her suffering in silence broke something inside him. He kept reading, through tears he didn't realize were falling. There were entries about long nights, about payments sent quietly, about fear that someone might discover. And then one that made him pause. Leonard Goldstein came by today. Harold's lawyer. He said a trust has been arranged for William, to be given only when he is old enough to understand. I don't know what that means. I told him William would grow strong without their money. But he said Harold insisted. William set the diary down, his heart pounding. A trust? Managed by a man named Leonard Goldstein? His mind raced. For 58 years, he had lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping through life with sweat and dignity, never once suspecting that another name, another world, had been stitched into his bloodline. He stared at the ceiling, the motel's cracked plaster catching the light like veins. The weight of what he'd read pressed against his chest, heavier than any burden before. His entire life, the poverty, the struggle, the endless labor to provide for a family that had now turned him away, all of it rested on a foundation of lies and withheld truths. He looked at his mother's handwriting again, softer in the final pages. If he ever finds this, I hope he forgives me. I wanted to protect him from their world, not deny him from it. One day when I am gone, maybe he will see that love and shame often come from the same place. William closed the diary slowly, holding it against his chest. He sat there in silence for a long time, the sound of a dripping faucet filling the room. Outside, a car passed, headlights slicing briefly through the window before disappearing into the night. He rose and walked to the mirror. The face staring back at him was tired, worn, but behind those weary eyes, something had shifted. Not anger yet. Not revenge. Something quieter. A dawning awareness that life had hidden more from him than he ever imagined. Harold James Sterling. The name carried weight, power, and scandal all at once. William whispered it aloud, tasting the syllables like a secret. Harold Sterling. The sound felt foreign and familiar, like something buried deep within his bones. He looked at his reflection again, and for the first time he didn't see the man others pitied. He saw the shadow of someone else's legacy staring back. He turned off the lamp and lay down, the diary still in his hand. The room fell into darkness, but his mind stayed wide awake. The pieces of his life were rearranging themselves, each revelation burning through the fog of grief. Outside, the motel's neon sign flickered weakly, vacancy, 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 a fitting echo for a man who just learned his own name had been half empty all his life. As the night deepened, William realized something with chilling clarity. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals aren't the ones that come from others, they're the truths the people we love most chose to hide. And this one, written in his mother's trembling hand, had just changed everything. Morning came gray and unwelcoming. The motel light flickered weakly against the damp air as William dressed in his best clothes. A pressed shirt, slacks that had known better days, and a coat that still smelled faintly of Elaine's lavender detergent. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his collar with trembling hands. For the first time in weeks, his reflection seemed to carry purpose, even if that purpose was built on confusion and disbelief. The diary sat open on the nightstand, the page marked by his mother's neat, fading script, Leonard Goldstein. He had repeated that name all night until it began to sound like both a promise and a test. Downtown Austin glimmered with morning traffic when William arrived. Towering glass buildings reflected the clouds, sharp against the pale sky. He felt small stepping into that world. A man shaped by hard labor and humility entering corridors of power that had never been meant for him. The law office was tucked in one of those towers, with a brass plaque that gleamed like judgment. Goldstein and Pierce, attorneys at law. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old leather. A young receptionist looked up, her voice polished, professional. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "I don't," William said, his voice steady but soft. Tell Mr. Leonard Goldstein, it's about Martha John. Her fingers froze mid-type. Something flickered across her expression. Curiosity, maybe even recognition. She nodded quickly and disappeared through a side door. Minutes passed before she returned. Mr. Goldstein will see you. William followed her into a large office with wide windows and shelves heavy with books. Behind an oak desk sat Leonard Goldstein, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of man whose age had only refined his authority. He looked up as William entered, studying him with quiet curiosity. Mr. John? He said finally, rising to his feet. It's been a very long time since I've heard that name. William nodded, holding out the diary. It's my mother's. I found it a few nights ago. Goldstein took it gently, as if holding something sacred. He opened it to a familiar page, his eyes softening. Martha, she was a remarkable woman. Honest, proud, perhaps too proud. Harold cared for her more than most ever knew. The sound of Harold on another man's lips made William's chest tighten. So it's true then, he said quietly. He was my father. Goldstein sighed, nodding slowly. Yes. Harold James Sterling. He made arrangements years ago, a trust in your name, under Martha's guardianship until her passing. She never touched a cent of it. Said her son would earn his life by his own hands. William's jaw clenched. She did. Every penny. Goldstein smiled faintly. I know. Harold respected her for that. It's why he insisted the trust remain open indefinitely, until you came forward. He walked to a cabinet and retrieved a folder, its edges yellowed with time. You should know, he continued, Harold kept records of you. Quietly. Your schooling, your marriage, even your daughter's birth. He never stopped watching from a distance, but his world, he paused. It wouldn't have allowed him to claim you. William's hands tightened into fists at his sides. So he watched while my mother worked 2 jobs and died with nothing? Goldstein met his eyes without flinching. Sometimes power makes cowards of men who once had hearts. I can't excuse him, but I can confirm he never forgot you. He opened the folder, sliding a single document across the desk. This is the trust. 1 million, indexed through investments over the years. It's yours. Legally, irrevocably. The words hung between them like thunder. William stared at the paper, at the numbers, the signatures, the stamp that bore his name, and felt a wave of disbelief crash over him. He had spent his life counting pennies, worrying about bills, sleeping in silence while his daughter turned away. And all this time, a fortune had waited for a truth no one dared to speak. Goldstein leaned back, studying him. You have 2 options, Mr. John. You can claim it quietly, live your life without anyone knowing. Or, his eyes narrowed slightly, testing the air. You can make it known. Publicly. The Sterling family name still carries weight. That would shake more than a few foundations. William didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, looking out over the city. Cars moved below like restless insects. People hurried to jobs, to meetings, to lives that never noticed men like him. His reflection in the glass stared back. Older, yes, but still standing. Still capable. For years people had spoken at him, not to him. Chad's words still stung, freeloader. Yet here he stood, a man tied by blood to a legacy worth millions. He turned back toward Goldstein, his voice calm but certain. I want it quiet. For now. Goldstein nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile forming. That's what your mother would have chosen. William gave a faint, tired smile. I'm not ready to wear another man's name. Not yet. Goldstein folded his hands. Then I'll arrange the transfer through a private LLC. Your identity will remain sealed. When you're ready to decide what to do with it, call me. As William rose to leave, the old lawyer reached out, his tone gentler now. Martha once told me something I've never forgotten, Goldstein said. The hardest truth is the one that makes you question your worth. But the moment you face it, you become free. You have her courage, Mr. John. Don't waste it. William nodded, his throat tight. He shook the man's hand, a firm, deliberate grip that felt like closing the door on one life and quietly unlocking another. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, its light bouncing off the mirrored buildings. He walked slowly down the street, the folder pressed to his chest beneath his coat. He passed a cafe window and caught his reflection again. Not the defeated man who'd left Amanda's apartment, but someone new. A man carrying truth, history, and power, and the silence to use it wisely. For the first time in months, he didn't feel lost. He felt ready. Life has a way of revealing secrets just when we think our story is over. Have you ever uncovered a truth that changed how you saw your own family? Where are you watching from tonight? And what did that moment teach you about forgiveness or strength? Share your story in the comments. You never know who it might reach. The night William received the funds, he didn't sleep. He sat by the motel window, watching the rain slide down the glass like memories he could finally let go of. The city hummed faintly in the distance, cars rushing toward destinations that felt unreachable for a man like him. But something had changed. Inside him, there was movement, quiet, deliberate, like a current finally breaking free beneath still waters. He laid the old diary beside the folder Goldstein had given him. The two objects, one worn by love, the other wrapped in power, seemed to represent two worlds that were never meant to touch. But now they did, and he was the bridge. The next morning he rented a small desk in a public co-working space. It smelled of coffee, ink, and quiet ambition, the scent of people trying to rewrite their lives. William's hands trembled as he clicked open a computer for the first time in years. He typed awkwardly, each key heavy, but determination steadied him. He began searching real estate listings across Austin, scanning property values, tax records, and ownership histories. Most of it didn't make sense at first, the jargon, the forms, the dense numbers, but William was a man built on patience. He had learned how to read people, now he would learn to read systems. Hours passed. Then something caught his eye. Notice of delinquent taxes, East Austin Apartments, property ID 77342. He froze. That address, it was Amanda and Chad's building. The same cracked walls, the same broken staircase, the same apartment where he had once been called a freeloader. William leaned closer, reading the fine print. The building had fallen behind on taxes. Chad's name appeared twice, once under the tenant records, once under manager. He was barely keeping it together. The bank had filed pre-foreclosure documents 2 months ago. William sat back, letting the weight of irony settle in. The man who'd thrown him out was now drowning in the same pit he'd dug with arrogance. Life, it seemed, had a way of circling back with surgical precision. He copied the property details and began researching how to buy it quietly. Goldstein's advice echoed in his mind, keep it quiet for now. The next few weeks became a blur of paperwork and late nights. William met with a quiet, sharp-eyed financial consultant recommended by Goldstein. They created an anonymous limited liability company, MJ Holdings LLC. The name carried both his mother's initials and his own, a silent tribute wrapped in secrecy. Through that LLC, William funneled the funds, careful to keep his name off every document. Each form he signed was a step deeper into a plan he didn't yet fully understand, only that it felt necessary, right? Not vengeance in the sense of destruction, but a restoration of balance. When the sale finally went through, the email arrived with a single line. Congratulations. You are now the official owner of 1114 East Austin Apartments. He sat still for a long moment, staring at the words. No smile, no celebration, just quiet breathing. The building that had once rejected him now belonged to him. The world, for once, had turned full circle. He visited the property a week later. He parked across the street, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the building's facade. It looked smaller now, more worn than he remembered. The windows sagged, the bricks discolored by neglect. A young couple pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. Someone had left a child's toy truck by the steps. Amanda wasn't home. But Chad's car sat in its usual place, dented and dull, like a life too proud to admit its rust. William didn't go inside. He didn't need to. Ownership wasn't about standing in those rooms again, it was about knowing that every light bill, every repair, every rent payment now passed through his hands. Over the following weeks he made small changes, subtle but intentional. The management company received new orders, rent reviews, renovation notices, lease renewals. Under the new ownership, rates would rise slightly to cover structural improvements. Chad, of course, would feel it first. At night, William would sit in his modest new rental home, sipping coffee and reading reports from the property manager. He saw Chad's complaints about the increase, his emails demanding explanations, his arguments about fairness. The responses came politely, corporate, and firm. Your lease terms remain subject to current market rates. William smiled faintly each time. It wasn't cruelty, it was correction. There was something quietly thrilling about watching the universe restore itself in slow motion. Not through violence, not through shouting, but through structure and patience. And yet, beneath the satisfaction there was sorrow. Because the woman who could have softened this, Amanda, remained silent. Her name hadn't appeared in any of the letters, not even once. One evening, William sat again with his mother's diary. He ran his fingers over the worn pages. She had once written, Vengeance never builds a home, but truth can reclaim one. He looked toward the night outside. Maybe he thought this wasn't revenge. Maybe it was reclamation, the quiet rebuilding of dignity brick by brick. Still, a part of him longed for Amanda's voice. For her to see what he had become, not to boast, but to make her remember the man she'd once called Dad without shame in her eyes. He closed the diary, set it gently on the table, and whispered into the silence, "This isn't over yet." Because deep down he knew, this was only the first movement in a much larger reckoning. And in the distance, somewhere in that East Austin building, Chad was about to learn that you never know who truly owns the ground beneath your feet. The summer heat in East Austin pressed down like a judgment. Even the air felt thick with exhaustion. Inside their apartment, Chad's voice cut through the walls, sharp, jagged, breaking against Amanda's silence. What had once been irritation had grown into something uglier, heavier. His pride was crumbling and he didn't know how to wear defeat without violence in his tone. Bills piled up on the counter. A past due notice from the new property management firm sat open on the table, its wording precise and cold. Rental adjustment effective immediately. Chad read it over and over, his jaw tightening with every line. "They can't do this to me," he muttered. "Me?" Amanda, sitting across the room, didn't answer. Her eyes were tired, red at the corners. She'd spent the last few nights crying quietly into her pillow, though Chad never noticed, or pretended not to. The rent increase had pushed them to the edge. His overtime hours were cut at the auto shop, and Amanda's part-time nursing job couldn't stretch far enough to cover the gap. Chad slammed the letter onto the table. "You just sit there," he snapped. "You don't say anything. You think silence fixes things? You think your tears pay rent?" Amanda flinched but didn't look up. "I'm trying, Chad." Trying?" He laughed bitterly. "You've been trying, since your old man moved out. Maybe if he hadn't dumped his sorry self on us, we wouldn't be in this mess." The words sliced deeper than he knew. Amanda looked away, fighting the sting behind her eyes. Somewhere deep down she knew the truth. Their problems didn't start with her father, they started with Chad's pride. His need to look powerful had drained them both, one decision at a time. But saying that out loud would only feed his rage. When he stormed out that evening, slamming the door so hard the frame shook, Amanda sat alone on the couch, her hands trembling. The quiet returned, heavy and suffocating. The clock ticked loud enough to fill the room. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over her contacts, then scrolled until she found the name she hadn't called in months, Dad. Her thumb hesitated, heart pounding. Then she pressed record on a voice message. "Dad?" Her voice broke slightly. "I don't even know if you'll listen to this. I'm sorry. For that night. For letting him say those things. You didn't deserve it. None of it." Pause. The sound of her breath shaking softly. "I wish you were here. Not for money, not for help, just to talk. I miss you." She ended the recording quickly, as if afraid of what she'd just done. The message arrived hours later, long after William had returned home from an evening walk. His modest Cedar Park rental was quiet, the kind of quiet he'd once craved and now couldn't bear. The glow of his phone broke the darkness of the living room. He saw her name. For a long time he couldn't bring himself to press play. His thumb hovered above the screen, the ache in his chest spreading like an old wound reopening. Finally he tapped it. Her voice filled the room, trembling, familiar, heartbreakingly sincere. Every word scraped against his pride, against the wall he'd built since that night he walked out with 2 suitcases. By the time the message ended, his hands were shaking. He listened again. Then again. But he didn't reply. Instead he walked to the window, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. Porch lights flickered across the street. Someone laughed faintly in the distance. The world kept moving, indifferent. Inside, William stood between 2 tides, anger and compassion. Anger, because her silence had broken him once, and compassion, because he could hear the echo of Elaine's softness in her voice. His late wife had always believed that love was stronger than pride. William wasn't sure anymore. The next morning he drove by their apartment building again. He didn't stop, he never did, but from the corner of the street he could see Amanda through the window. She was watering a plant, her movements small and distracted. Chad's car was gone. She looked thinner, paler, weighed down by something deeper than money troubles. William stayed parked for a few minutes, watching quietly. The ache that filled him wasn't just sorrow. It was memory, of her laughter as a child, of her mother's touch, of a home that once smelled like cinnamon and morning light. He wanted to get out of the car. To knock on the door. To tell her he had seen her messages, that he forgave her before she ever asked. But pride, That same thing that once destroyed him, kept his hand on the steering wheel. Instead, he whispered to the empty air, "Not yet." Because this wasn't the right time. Not while Chad's shadow still lingered in her life. Not while her voice trembled with confusion instead of conviction. He drove away, but the sound of her voicemail followed him, a fragile melody of regret he couldn't silence. That night, William sat on his porch with the diary open in his lap. His mother's words from decades ago stared back at him. Forgiveness is the final rebellion of the wounded. He exhaled, slow and steady, and closed the book. Some rebellions, he thought, take time. And in the distance, inside that same apartment where he had once been humiliated, pride was eating Chad alive. One unpaid bill, one argument, one silent glance at a woman whose heart was slipping away. It wouldn't be long now before the house of arrogance fell completely. And when it did, William knew he'd be ready to face what came after, not as the broken man who'd left, but as the father who'd finally learned to wait. The morning was quiet when William drove out toward Evergreen Cemetery. A low mist clung to the grass, and the sun had barely broken through the clouds. He parked beneath an old oak tree and sat there for a long time, staring at the headstones stretching out like memories frozen in stone. He hadn't been here in years. Not since the funeral. Not since the day they lowered Martha John into the earth and he'd stood too proud to cry. He remembered holding Elaine's hand, her thumb tracing the back of his fingers, the only thing that had kept him from collapsing that day. Now Elaine was gone too. And the silence around him was absolute. William reached across the seat and picked up the diary. Its pages had begun to yellow at the edges, the ink faint, but her voice lived inside those words like she had never left. He walked slowly to the grave. The name Martha L. John, 1932 to 1996, was etched simply, without flourish, just as she'd wanted. A small stone angel watched over her, its face weathered smooth by rain. William knelt beside it, brushed the leaves away and whispered, "Hey, Mama." The air seemed to still. He opened the diary and began to read, his voice trembling. June 18, 1964. I saw him again today. Mr. Sterling. The way he looked at me in that kitchen made me forget who I was supposed to be. But I reminded myself, love like that has no place in his world. William's throat tightened. He flipped to another page. August 2, 1964. He gave me a book of poems and said I had more grace than the women who dine at his table. I told him not to say things like that. He just smiled, said he didn't care who saw. His voice faltered. He could almost see it. His mother, young and beautiful, walking through that mansion with her head bowed, dusting crystal vases and sweeping marble floors. Her hair tied back, her eyes soft but steady. Harold Sterling watching her from the doorway, his suit immaculate, his expression conflicted. William closed his eyes and the scene came alive in his mind, the first flashback. Martha hums as she polishes a brass banister. The room gleams with wealth, but she moves like someone who belongs to none of it. Harold steps into the frame, his tone low and hesitant. You shouldn't be here this late. She smiles faintly. Neither should you, sir. They stand there, two people on opposite sides of a wall built by class, race and expectation. Yet in that stillness, something fragile forms. A look. Pause. A shared understanding of loneliness. Weeks later, another memory, Martha sits in the garden behind the mansion, tears streaking her face as Harold presses a folded envelope into her hand. They found out, he says quietly. My wife, her family. You need to go. Her voice breaks. And what about the child? Harold's jaw tightens. He can't meet her eyes. I'll take care of you both. I swear it. But she knows what that means. Distance, secrecy, silence. The memory fades. William's eyes opened to the stillness of the cemetery. The diary trembled in his hands. All his life he had felt like an outsider, a man never fully belonging anywhere. Now he understood why. His mother had lived her entire life in the shadow of a love that society would never allow. And Harold Sterling, the man who could have changed everything, chose silence. Just like Amanda had. Just like he had. He pressed his palm against the cold stone. You spent your whole life protecting people who never protected you, he said softly. And I became one of them. I'm sorry, Mama. The wind picked up, stirring the leaves around him. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, their sound thin and haunting. He looked down at the diary again, finding one last entry written in shaky handwriting. If he ever finds this, tell him, silence doesn't keep love safe. It only buries it alive. Tears stung his eyes. He realized then that every man who had shaped his life, Harold Sterling, Leonard Goldstein, even Chad, had worn silence like armor. It was the language of men who feared vulnerability, who mistook quiet for strength. But Martha had seen through it. She had chosen to live with dignity instead of exposure, to carry love quietly rather than let it destroy her. That choice had built the walls William grew up inside. And now it was his burden to tear them down. He knelt lower, his voice breaking. "I'll end it, Mama. I promise you. The silence ends with me." For a long time he stayed there, not praying, not speaking, just breathing beside her. The weight in his chest began to shift, replaced by something steadier, clearer. When he finally stood, the sun had risen higher, spilling gold across the rows of stones. He looked at her name one last time, then carefully set the diary on top of the grave. Not to leave it behind, but to let the earth hear the story that had been buried too long. He whispered, "You were never just someone's secret." Then he turned and walked away, the wind carrying the faint rustle of pages behind him. As he reached the gate, he glanced back once more, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like an orphan. He felt like a man stepping out of the silence his family had lived in for generations. Somewhere deep inside, the echoes of both his father's cowardice and his mother's strength intertwined, shaping him into something neither of them had ever been brave enough to become. A man unafraid to speak, to act, to reclaim what was his. And as he walked back toward his car, the path ahead seemed clearer than ever, not revenge for revenge's sake, but a reckoning born from truth. The kind that could heal. Or destroy. But this time it would not be silent. The evening heat pressed against the walls of the East Austin apartment complex like a slow, suffocating hand. In the cramped common room, tenants filled every folding chair, their voices low, their faces drawn tight with worry and resentment. Flyers about the rent increase littered the tables. "Unjust raise. Demand answers." Someone had even taped a handwritten sign to the wall, "We deserve respect." Amanda sat near the back, her fingers twisted in her lap, eyes darting toward the door. Chad stood at the front, pacing like a man preparing for war. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his expression coiled and mean. He had become the self-appointed voice of the tenants, feeding off their frustration to hide his own humiliation. "This is robbery," he barked, turning to the crowd. "The new owners think they can jack up the rent without giving us better plumbing, better lighting, nothing. We've lived here for years, and now they want to throw us out like trash." A few tenants nodded, murmuring agreement. Others looked uneasy, caught between anger and fear. Amanda spoke softly, "Chad, maybe we should just wait to hear what they say." He spun on her. "Don't start with that, Amanda. You think being quiet helps? That's what your father taught you, remember?" Her face tightened. His words landed like stones, but she said nothing. Moments later, the property manager entered, a short, meticulous man in a gray suit. His presence alone silenced the room. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the tense crowd. "Thank you all for coming. I understand there are concerns about the recent rate adjustments. The owner has asked that I clarify certain matters tonight, and to do so, a representative from the ownership group will be addressing you directly." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Chad crossed his arms. "Good. Let's hear from the coward behind the curtain." The manager nodded toward the door. "He'll be here shortly." The door opened, and in stepped William John. The air changed instantly. Conversation stopped mid-word. Chairs creaked. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to dim in the silence that followed. Amanda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes widened, and for a second she looked like a little girl again, the same child who used to run to him after thunderstorms, whispering, "I'm scared, Daddy." Chad's jaw locked. The color drained from his face, but his pride didn't let him move. William stood there, composed and immovable. He wore a simple navy suit, the same one from Elaine's funeral, now pressed and spotless. His silver beard caught the light, his eyes were calm, too calm. "Evening," he said quietly. His voice filled the room without force, steady as stone. "I appreciate everyone coming out." He took a few steps forward, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Some of the tenants recognized him vaguely, the quiet older man who used to live on the third floor. Others just sensed the authority in his presence. The property manager handed him a folder and stepped aside. William looked around the room once more, his tone measured. "I won't take much of your time. My name is William John. Some of you may remember me. I used to live here not long ago." A whisper moved through the chairs. Chad shifted uneasily, his hand curling into a fist at his side. William continued, "When I left, I told myself I'd never walk back into this building again. But life has a strange way of bringing us full circle." He opened the folder, glanced briefly at the papers inside, then looked directly at Chad. As of 2 months ago, this building, every apartment, every brick, every blade of grass out front, belongs to me. The words landed like thunder. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a pen. Amanda's breath caught audibly. Chad's expression twisted, disbelief first, then fury. "You're lying," Chad said, his voice shaking. "You think you can come in here and—" The property manager interrupted softly, holding up a notarized document. "It's true. Ownership transferred to MJ Holdings LLC, managed by Mr. William John." Chad stared, jaw trembling. You think this is funny?" He turned to Amanda. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head, tears already forming. "No, I didn't." William didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You called me a freeloader once, Chad. In my daughter's home. You told me to pack my things and leave because I was a burden." His voice remained calm, every word deliberate. "I didn't argue then. I walked out with 2 suitcases and my dignity. I suppose this," he gestured around the room, "is what dignity can build when it's left alone long enough." The room stayed silent. Amanda was crying now, quiet, controlled, the kind of tears that don't come from pain alone but from realization. She saw it now, the cost of silence, the weight of every moment she hadn't spoken up. William turned to the tenants, softening his tone. "I'm not here to throw anyone out. I know what it's like to lose a home. The rent increases are part of restoring this building, not destroying it. But I won't tolerate disrespect or manipulation. If you want fairness, you'll have it, from me." Then finally he turned back to Chad. "If you choose to stay, you'll do it with respect. Not arrogance. Not cruelty. I've lived too long watching men mistake pride for strength. That ends here." Chad opened his mouth, but no sound came. His throat worked as he tried to swallow the humiliation burning in him. William gave him one last look, not of vengeance but of finality. Then he turned to the crowd, nodded once and walked toward the door. The tenants watched him go, silent, almost reverent. Amanda whispered through tears, "Daddy?" But the word caught in her throat. He paused briefly in the doorway, not turning around. "You know where to find me," he said softly, and then he was gone. Outside, the night air was cooler. William exhaled, his heart steady, his steps unhurried. He didn't look back. Inside that building, the walls that had once suffocated him were now his. But the real victory wasn't ownership. It was peace. Still, as he walked away, he knew the storm inside that apartment, between Chad's pride and Amanda's awakening, was only beginning. And this time he wouldn't be the one left standing in the silence. Rain fell in thin, hesitant streaks against the window of the old roadside motel, tracing crooked lines down the glass. Inside, the room was dim, one lamp flickering near the bed, a half-empty coffee cup on the nightstand, and a worn leather journal resting beside it. William sat quietly at the small table by the window, staring into the night as if searching for something that wasn't there. The silence was heavy but no longer suffocating, just still. A soft knock broke through the rain. He hesitated, then rose, the floor creaking under his steps. When he opened the door, Amanda stood there, drenched, trembling, eyes swollen from crying. She clutched her purse tightly, her breath uneven, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad." The word cracked something open inside him. He stepped aside without a word, letting her in. She crossed the threshold like someone walking into a memory, slowly, unsure if she still belonged there. Water dripped from her hair onto the worn carpet. The scent of rain mixed with the faint smell of instant coffee and old air conditioning. William handed her a towel, quietly. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," he said, his voice calm, almost detached. "I didn't know where else to go," she replied, voice trembling. He studied her. His daughter, the same little girl who once clung to his leg after nightmares, now standing before him hollowed out by guilt and time. Her face carried traces of Elaine's grace but burdened by a sorrow that had aged her too young. Amanda sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the towel like it could anchor her. "I left him," she whispered. "I left Chad." William said nothing, only nodded once. She looked up, tears spilling freely now. "You were right. About everything. I just didn't want to see it. I thought if I kept the peace, if I stayed quiet, maybe things wouldn't fall apart. But all I did was help him destroy everything good around me." Her words trembled, each syllable soaked in regret. She reached into her purse and pulled out the faded diary, the same one that had changed William's life. Its edges were frayed, the ink blurred with age. "I found this," she said, voice breaking. "In the box you left behind. I read it." She paused, swallowing hard. "I read about Grandma Martha. About Harold Sterling. About everything you never said. William's gaze softened. He took a slow breath and sat across from her. It wasn't something I wanted to pass down, he said quietly. Some truths don't heal when you speak them. They just expose the scars. Amanda shook her head, wiping her cheeks. No. You were protecting me. And her voice cracked again. I wasn't protecting you. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the rain. William looked at her, really looked, and saw not just his daughter but a woman finally facing the truth she'd avoided for years. He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. Do you remember what your mother used to say when we argued? He asked softly. Amanda's eyes lifted, confused. She said a lot of things. William smiled faintly, almost to himself. Silence doesn't fix what the heart refuses to face. Amanda let out a fragile laugh through her tears. She did say that. I just never understood what it meant until now. William nodded. Neither did I back then. The rain thickened outside, drumming softly against the window. Amanda's eyes drifted toward the diary again. Dad, she loved you so much, she whispered. Grandma. The way she wrote about you, the way she wanted you to be proud of who you were, no matter where you came from, it broke me. William's throat tightened. She carried her shame in silence so I wouldn't have to, he said. And I suppose I passed that silence on to you. Amanda reached out, taking his hand, something she hadn't done since Elaine's funeral. No, she said firmly, shaking her head. You were the only one who loved without condition. I just didn't see it. Chad made me believe you were weak because you forgave too easily. But now I see, forgiveness is what made you strong. He looked down at their joined hands, her fingers trembling in his. I wasn't always strong, Amanda, he said. There were nights I wanted to disappear. When I thought leaving was easier than being unwanted. Tears slid down her cheeks. I made you feel that way. William squeezed her hand gently. You were lost. I was too. But you came back, that's what matters. She broke then, sobs shaking her shoulders, her face buried in her palms. William moved closer, his hand resting lightly on her back, his voice low. It's all right, he murmured. It's all right, baby girl. For the first time in years, she let herself cry in her father's arms. Not as a woman trying to hold herself together, but as a daughter who had finally let go of all the guilt, pride, and fear that had kept her silent. When her breathing steadied, she lifted her head. I want to start over, she whispered. I want to make things right. If you'll let me. William looked at her for a long time, seeing both the child he'd raised and the woman she'd become. Then he smiled, faint but genuine. You don't need my permission to do what's right, he said. You just need courage. Amanda nodded slowly, wiping her tears. Outside, the rain began to ease, turning into a soft drizzle. The neon sign from the motel flickered through the curtains. Red, then white, then red again, pulsing like a tired heartbeat. Amanda looked toward the window. What will you do now? William leaned back, his expression peaceful. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe for once I'll just live without running from the silence. She smiled faintly. Maybe I could help with that. He glanced at her, eyes warm. Maybe you already are. They sat together for a while, no words, no explanations, just the quiet understanding that sometimes, love isn't in what's said but in what's finally heard. Outside, dawn began to push through the clouds, painting the wet pavement gold. A new day was coming. And for Amanda, for William, for the first time in a long time, the silence finally felt like peace. Sometimes the hardest forgiveness isn't for others, it's for ourselves. Watching Amanda face her truth and William open his heart again reminds us how silence can both wound and heal. Have you ever had to rebuild a broken bond with someone you love? Or wished you could? Tell me where you're watching from and share your story in the comments. Your voice might be the one that helps someone else find the courage to forgive. The storm that followed wasn't made of rain, it was made of paper, signatures, accusations, and silence sharpened into weapons. Chad had always believed in one thing above all else: control. Even stripped of comfort and respect, he thought he could still twist the law into his armor. The summons arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. William opened the envelope slowly, eyes scanning the dense legal language: defamation, fraudulent ownership, emotional distress. It was absurd, yet perfectly in line with the man Chad had become. For a moment, William sat still, the weight of the paper in his hands like old chains being thrown back around him. Then, quietly, he picked up his phone and called the one man who had been waiting for this moment, Leonard Goldstein. By the time William arrived at Goldstein's downtown office, the lawyer had already pulled the necessary files. The room smelled of polished wood and old law books, sunlight glancing off framed certificates. Goldstein looked up from his desk with that familiar steady calm, a man who had fought many storms and learned to let facts do the shouting. "So," he said, sliding the document across the desk, "Mr. Chadwell Jenkins believes he can rewrite truth." William gave a tired nod. "He's angry. And desperate." "Desperation," Goldstein replied, leaning back in his chair, "is the most predictable kind of foolishness." The next few days unfolded like a quiet chess match. Chad's lawyer, young, overconfident, flooded the courthouse with claims of elder exploitation, document tampering, and secret inheritances. Reporters caught wind of the case, and soon whispers ran through East Austin like wildfire. People loved scandal more than truth. But Goldstein knew how to peel lies apart, layer by layer. He and his small team moved with precision, tracing Chad's financial history, bank accounts, leases, credit reports, and tax returns. What they uncovered was damning: years of unpaid taxes, falsified rental records, and even unreported tenant deposits pocketed for personal use. One document stood out: a lease agreement Chad had forged in his mother's name to siphon money through a fake maintenance company. The arrogance of it made Goldstein almost laugh. When the court date arrived, William sat quietly behind his lawyer, hands clasped. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Chad swaggered in wearing an expensive suit, jaw set, eyes blazing with performative outrage. Amanda wasn't there; she refused to feed the theater. The judge, an older black woman with sharp eyes and little patience, opened the proceedings briskly. Chad's lawyer began with passion, painting his client as a hard-working man betrayed by deceit and manipulation. William supposed anonymous ownership, they claimed, was a malicious act meant to humiliate and destroy a family. Then Goldstein rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He simply unfolded the truth with the calmness of someone holding all the light in the room. "Your Honor," he began, "this case isn't about ownership. It's about responsibility and the consequences of avoiding it." He handed the clerk a thick folder. "Inside you'll find evidence of tax evasion, falsified rental documentation, and misuse of trust funds, all under Mr. Jenkins' management. The building was lawfully purchased by an LLC after foreclosure. No fraud. No deception. Only justice served through the same system Mr. Jenkins sought to manipulate." The judge flipped through the pages, her expression tightening. The silence grew thicker with every turn. Chad's lawyer tried to object, but Goldstein remained unshaken. "And finally," Goldstein continued, "you'll find correspondence from the bank confirming that the foreclosure process began before my client's LLC purchase, meaning Mr. Jenkins' claim to ownership is not only false but provably negligent." Chad shifted uneasily, his confidence beginning to fray. The judge's gaze lifted, cutting through the room like a blade. "Mr. Jenkins," she said sternly, "do you have an explanation for this?" Chad's lips moved but no words came. Goldstein closed his briefcase slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "the truth doesn't need to be defended. It only needs to be seen." When the gavel fell, it was like thunder breaking the air. The suit was dismissed with prejudice. Chad's reputation collapsed in a single echo. His name, once loud and commanding, began to fade beneath the weight of public record and quiet shame. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Chad pushed past them, face flushed, eyes burning. William stood at a distance, watching him. There was no satisfaction, only a quiet, weary understanding. Revenge had never been the goal. Truth was. Goldstein stepped beside him, hands in his coat pockets. "You handled yourself with dignity," he said. "Most men, after what you've been through, would have wanted more blood." William shook his head. "There's no peace in someone else's ruin." Goldstein nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And that's why, despite everything, you'll walk away free. Not just legally, but here." He tapped his chest lightly. "Inside." William looked toward the courthouse steps, where Chad stood alone under the weight of his own choices. The sky had turned overcast, gray clouds rolling low across the city. For the first time, William didn't feel small. He didn't feel forgotten. He felt seen, by his mother's spirit, by the truth, and by the silent echo of the man he had finally become. As he walked away with Goldstein beside him, the sound of their footsteps on the courthouse marble seemed to erase the past one echo at a time. The shadows had been long, but they no longer belonged to him. The days after the court's judgment felt eerily still. The noise that had followed William, the accusations, the courtroom whispers, the looks from people who once pitied him, faded into silence. It wasn't peace yet, but it was something close. He sat on the edge of the motel bed that had been both his refuge and his reminder of exile. The thin sunlight filtering through the blinds drew pale stripes across the carpet. A suitcase lay open at his feet, half filled with neatly folded clothes. The smell of rain still clung faintly to the walls, though the sky outside had cleared. Amanda was kneeling beside a box, sorting through his few possessions. Old shirts, a pair of shoes with worn soles, a framed photograph of Elaine smiling at a family barbecue years ago. She handled everything gently like it was sacred. "You don't need to keep all this," she said softly. "You deserve better things now. A new place. A fresh start." William smiled faintly, watching her work. "A man can't start over without remembering where he came from," he said. "Even if it hurts a little." She looked up at him, eyes tender. "It doesn't have to hurt forever, Dad?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the photo of Elaine, her laughter frozen in time, her joy undimmed by the years. He thought about all the things she'd endured quietly, all the ways she'd held their family together without complaint. She'd been the glue that made home feel sacred. Without her, everything had splintered. Amanda sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap. "You could buy a house," she said, her tone hopeful. "A good one. Something with space and light, not this dark room with flickering lamps." William chuckled quietly. "You sound like your mother," he said. "She used to dream of a porch big enough for her morning coffee." "Then build it for her," Amanda replied. "For both of you." The words hung between them, gentle but powerful. William nodded slowly, his eyes turning toward the window. The city outside moved at its usual rhythm. Cars passing, people hurrying, life resuming as if nothing monumental had just happened. But inside something was shifting. He had won. Chad was gone, his lies exposed, his pride shattered. The building, the symbol of everything William had suffered and reclaimed, now belonged entirely to him. But as he stared at the folded deed papers on the table, victory felt hollow. He thought of his mother's diary, of her hope that one day her son would rise not by vengeance but by grace. He thought of Harold Sterling, the father who never claimed him, and of the kind of man he didn't want to become. Amanda's voice broke through his thoughts. "What are you going to do with the building?" He took a long breath. "Sell it?" She blinked. "Sell it? After everything?" He nodded. "It served its purpose. It was never about owning it, just proving to myself that I could stand again." Amanda frowned, unsure. "You could make a fortune holding on to it." He looked at her kindly. "And spend the rest of my life protecting something that came out of pain? No. That's not living, baby girl. That's just holding on to the ashes." Her eyes softened with understanding. By the weekend the sale was done. The LLC transferred the deed to a local investor, and William signed the final papers with steady hands. Half the proceeds went into his account. The other half he quietly directed toward something else, something that carried weight and meaning. The Martha John Shelter for Women and Children opened quietly on the east side of Austin, in a converted church building with sunlight pouring through high windows. William walked the halls one morning, listening to the faint laughter of children, the soft murmurs of mothers starting over. A framed plaque hung by the entrance. In honor of Martha John, who chose love over shame, and taught her son to forgive without forgetting. Amanda joined him that day, standing silently by his side. "She would have been proud," she said. "I hope so," he murmured. As they walked out into the open air, William felt something lift, not just the burden of revenge but the years of silence, guilt, and unspoken pain. Mercy, he realized, wasn't weakness. It was a kind of strength only found through fire. That night, back at the motel, he packed the last of his things for the final time. He ran a hand across the nightstand where the diary had rested for weeks. The motel key lay beside it. Amanda appeared in the doorway, smiling softly. "The new house is ready," she said. "Cedar Park. Big windows, quiet street. Just like Mom would have liked." William turned off the lamp and stood. "Then let's go home," he said simply. They walked out together, father and daughter, not as broken people trying to fix the past, but as two souls learning to live with it. The neon motel sign flickered behind them, then went dark. The night was cool, the road stretching ahead like a clean page waiting to be written on. And for William John, the man who had lost everything only to find himself again, the journey toward peace had finally begun. The morning sun rose warm and golden over East Austin, painting the sky with streaks of quiet redemption. The old church building that once stood abandoned now gleamed with fresh white paint and clean glass windows. In its rebirth, it carried a name that held generations of pain and pride, the Martha home. William stood outside the entrance, his hands folded in front of him, watching volunteers arrange the last few chairs under a canopy. The air smelled of new beginnings, fresh paint, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of flowers brought by neighbors who didn't even know the full story behind the name. They just knew it stood for something good. Amanda arrived soon after, wearing a soft cream dress and carrying a bouquet of lilies, her mother's favorite. She paused when she saw the sign above the door, the black letters bold against the white wall. The Martha Home, a place for second chances. Her throat tightened. She turned to her father, eyes glistening. "It's perfect," she whispered. William nodded, his expression calm but heavy with feeling. "She deserved her name to mean something more than what they said about her," he murmured. They stepped inside together, the cool air of the building wrapping around them. The sound of soft piano music filled the small lobby, mingling with low voices and laughter. A few women stood by the reception desk, survivors of broken homes, lost jobs, and forgotten promises, each carrying her own story, her own silence. Amanda watched as her father greeted them one by one, his handshake firm but kind, his eyes warm. "This place is for you," he said quietly to a young mother holding a toddler. "No one here has to hide who they are." The woman nodded through tears, whispering a thank you that seemed too small for what she felt. At the far end of the lobby, framed photographs hung on a wall titled Roots. At the center was a black and white picture of Martha John, young, beautiful, dressed in her work uniform, eyes full of quiet determination. Beside her, a smaller portrait of Harold James Sterling, the man who had once lived behind power and secrecy. Together, the two images told a story of forbidden love and the generations born from its silence. Amanda stood before the photographs, her eyes locked on Martha's face. "She looks so much like you," she said softly. William smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You've got more of her in you than I ever did. Her grace. Her fight." The ceremony began quietly. There were no reporters, no speeches meant for applause, just a few dozen people, gathered to witness something honest. Goldstein stood near the front, looking older but proud, his hand resting on a cane. When he caught William's eye, he nodded, a gesture that said everything words couldn't. A pastor from the community offered a short prayer. "For the women who walk through these doors, may they find not pity but power. And for the man who built these walls from forgiveness, may his peace be full." When William stepped forward to speak, his voice carried steady, low, and clear. "My mother," he began, "wasn't born into wealth or power. She was born into judgment, but she chose love anyway. She taught me that dignity isn't something you're given. It's something you hold on to even when the world tries to take it from you." He paused, glancing toward the photo wall. "For years her story was hidden because people said it brought shame. But I've learned that shame only survives in silence. Today her name stands on this building, not as a secret but as a symbol. Of truth. Of mercy. Of resilience." The crowd was still, every face softened by the weight of his words. William's gaze found Amanda's, and for a brief moment he saw not the distance of past years but the connection restored, a daughter who had rediscovered her father not through vengeance but through grace. When the ribbon was cut, a gentle cheer rose through the air. Children ran past with laughter, filling the hallways with life. The walls that once echoed with emptiness now held voices of hope. Later, as the sun dipped low, Amanda and William lingered in the courtyard. A breeze carried the faint hum of the city, blending with the sound of footsteps from women finding their way home, perhaps for the first time in years. Amanda placed her hand on her father's arm. "You've turned pain into something living," she said. "Into something that helps people breathe again." William smiled, a deep, tired smile filled with peace. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "I just stopped running from the silence long enough to listen." They stood together as the lights came on, illuminating the words "The Martha Home" in soft golden glow. And for William, the son of a woman the world once tried to erase, the sight felt like redemption made real, love no longer hidden, truth no longer burdened. His mother's legacy had finally found its voice. And this time the silence was sacred. The road to Cedar Hill was quiet that morning, lined with trees turning the color of old gold. The air smelled of pine and memory. William's pickup truck rumbled over the gravel path that led to a small house perched on the edge of a gentle slope. The same house where his father once lived, years before the secrets and silence had driven them apart. Now it stood weathered but waiting, its wooden porch sagging slightly, its windows dull with time. To anyone else it was just another forgotten home. But to William, it was a chance to finish what history had left undone, not through anger but through grace. He stepped out of the truck, toolbox in hand. The morning light fell across his face, warm and forgiving. He looked at the house for a long while before whispering, "Let's start again." Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of rebuilding became his prayer. Each nail he drove into the beams echoed like a heartbeat. Each sweep of the brush against the wood carried the sound of restoration, not just of a house but of a soul. The scent of sawdust mixed with the faint trace of oil from his tools, grounding him in something simple and real. He worked quietly without rush. Sometimes in the hush of late afternoon, he'd pause to watch the horizon, where the fields stretched wide and open, where silence wasn't loneliness anymore but peace. Amanda began visiting every Sunday. She'd drive up with a basket of food, laughter in her eyes, her presence like sunlight breaking through years of clouds. "You really built this by yourself?" she teased one afternoon, handing him a cup of lemonade. William chuckled softly. "Every plank, every hinge. I wanted to touch something real again." Amanda looked around the living room, freshly painted, modestly furnished, filled with the smell of cedar. On the mantel sat two framed photos, one of her grandmother Martha and one of a young Harold Sterling, smiling faintly beside a vintage car. For the first time, those two images shared the same room, not as scandal but as story. She placed her hand over his. "You gave them both peace." William nodded slowly. "And in a way they gave it back." That evening as dusk fell they sat together on the porch. Crickets hummed in the grass. Fireflies blinked in the distance, small lanterns of memory. Amanda leaned her head on his shoulder and for a long time neither spoke. Finally William broke the silence. "I used to think legacy was about what people remember you for. But it's not. It's about what you build in others, what stays standing after you're gone." Amanda smiled through quiet tears. "Then you've built something unbreakable." He turned to her, his voice low but steady. "No. We did." When she drove away later that night, William stayed on the porch watching her taillights disappear down the road. Then he turned toward the house, his house, their history, and whispered a soft prayer under his breath. The wind carried it away gently over the hill, through the trees. A prayer of gratitude. A prayer of completion. And for the first time in a long time, William John felt the world settle into balance. He was no longer the boy who lost everything. He was the man who rebuilt, one beam at a time until even silence could sing. The dawn came slowly, the kind that doesn't rush but unfolds tender and golden, over the quiet hills of Cedar Hill. The first light slipped through the lace curtains of William's small study, brushing gently across the old wooden desk. On it lay a single object, his mother's diary, worn and soft-edged, the binding nearly gone. William sat before it, pen in hand, the ink bottle beside him catching the glow of morning. His movements were slow but sure, his breathing steady, like a man who had finally outrun every storm that ever chased him. The house around him was silent except for the creak of settling wood, the faint hum of life outside. Somewhere in the yard, a bluebird sang, fragile but certain. He turned to the last empty page. The paper felt delicate beneath his fingers, almost sacred. For a long time he simply stared at it. So much had been said in those pages. The grief of his mother, the shame of a hidden love, his own years of silence and loss. But now there was nothing left to explain. Only truth. He began to write, the pen gliding slowly across the page. "To Amanda, you are more than your mistakes. And I am more than my pain." He set the pen down and exhaled deeply, as though releasing a lifetime in one breath. The words sat there, still and powerful, closing the circle that began long before he was born. He ran his fingers over the ink, a quiet smile pulling at his lips. Not the smile of triumph but of peace. The kind that only comes when forgiveness finds a place to rest. Outside the light grew stronger. It filled the room, touching the photos on the mantel. Martha's gentle face, Harold's somber eyes, Amanda's bright smile. For a fleeting moment, it seemed they were all together again, bound not by blood or secrecy, but by understanding. William closed the diary. He leaned back in his chair, watching the sunlight spill across the floorboards. His reflection shimmered faintly in the windowpane. Older now, yes, but free. The house was alive again, not with voices but with peace. Every wall, every beam, every shadow held the story of what was lost and what was reclaimed. As the day began, William whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, for the silence and for the sound." Then he looked out at the horizon, that soft, forgiving sky, and smiled one last time. A man who had faced his ghosts, forgiven his blood, and built something pure from the wreckage. A man who had finally come home. Some stories don't end in revenge, they end in redemption. William's final words remind us that peace doesn't come from what we gain, but from what we release. Have you ever found healing in forgiving someone, or yourself? Tell me where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments. Someone out there might need your story to believe that peace is still possible.